Here we go. So hi, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. And we hope that after this next hour, you'll be inspired and you'll learn something new. And to those of you who are attending your first event of Climate Week, welcome, and be sure to check out some of the additional events. There are a lot of other exciting things going on this week. I know that there are other youth-focused panels as well as tech-focused, business-focused panels. So for whatever you're interested in, I'm sure you'll find something here at Climate Week that you'll enjoy. And so I'll post a link to the rest of the events at the end of the hour. So in today's panel, we're going to discuss how we can mobilize more young people for equitable climate solutions. And I'm your moderator, Karina, and I'm a high school senior in New York City. I spent the last few years working on addressing climate through finance, actually was my first intro to climate, and through academic research projects. And I'm super interested in exploring further on the environmental justice side. So I'm very excited to feature these three amazing women today and show you their perspectives and experiences. So feel free to drop any questions that you have as we go along into the Q&A box in the chat. The hosts and panelists can see all the questions, and so we'll be sure to integrate some of what you're curious about specifically as we go on here. And so I'm going to stop talking without further ado. We're going to get started, and I'll give a brief intro on our panelists for the hour. So Chante, you can give a little wave. Chante Harris is the Senior Manager of Venture for Climate Tech at Second Muse and is a co-founder of the Women of Color Collective in Sustainability. Paige, you can also say hi. She's the Manager of Communications and Culture at the Boston Ujima Project, and she writes at the intersection of environmentalism, Blackness, and pop culture. And Kiana, who's a senior at UC Berkeley, and she's also the CEO of Circularity, which is an environmental justice education platform. So before we get into the first piece of our discussion, I decided we'd start off with a little bit of an icebreaker, but more just to sort of get to know you, short 2-sentence piece of advice from each of the panelists. Let's have you all tell us one thing that you've learned from your experience in the climate space. And Chante, we can start with you and then go over to Paige and Kiana.
And think about this one before. So I mean, one thing I've learned really that you're always learning, and that's okay. I mean, I think climate is such a big problem that we've spent a long time creating. And so there really is no, I think, shortcut or like bullet solution. I think an understanding that it's okay to not know everything while also, wanting to continue to develop your own insight and thoughts around the space is important.
Yeah, totally.
Hear me okay?
Yeah.
I'm sure my mic is awesome. Cool. Hi, everyone. I'm Paige. This is a great question. I would say that I've learned that the world of climate is what I'm going to call a do-ocracy, right? If there's something that you think is missing or needs to be done, just do it. Don't wait for people to ask you to do it, or don't wait for permission. If you think it's in your wheelhouse or in your own possibility, just try and do it or try things out and see what happens.
Yeah, that's great advice. And I'm sure for anyone who's in the audience, I know we have younger students, even middle schoolers in the audience today. So for you all, it's certainly possible to pick up your own things, even if you think, oh, I'm 12, 13, 14, now is the time.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think for me, what one of the biggest things that I have learned throughout these many years of working in the space, I think, is that always question who the people that say they're experts, question that, because it's very likely that those aren't actually the experts in climate change or climate injustices. It's typically not people in academia or people in policy or people that speak as experts that are the experts. It's usually the people at the front lines and the communities facing a lot of these issues that are the experts. So when you're trying to really learn about something, go to the frontline communities first, go learn from them, and then you'll have a better understanding of what being an expert in something actually means.
Yeah, that's great advice. Especially that's something that hopefully in my in my journeys beyond high school that I get to do a little bit more. So thank you all. And so for the first piece of our discussion, we're going to focus on what Kiana was talking about, one of the most complex, but also very important aspects of our solution to the climate crisis, and that's environmental justice, or EJ for short. So the EPA defines environmental justice as the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. So that's a lot of words, but these two concepts of fair treatment and meaningful involvement are very key when we talk about environmental justice. And so now to our panelists here, I want to pose a quick question. So let's do a temperature check of sorts on environmental justice right now. So what progress has been made and what work still needs to be done? So Kiana, since you're on the front lines of this, we can start with you.
Yeah, could we put the questions in the chat just so that's,
sure.
Thank you. I'm like very much I have to like read something to absorb it.
Yep, there we go, we got it.
Cool, okay, so what progress has been made? I think the environmental justice movement has existed since the very start of this country, because as we all know, this country was founded on colonization and the genocide of indigenous peoples, and environmental justice is very much a cause that has been led by Black, Indigenous people of color throughout the history of this country, and is something that still hasn't really been achieved, and something that as organizers and activists we continue to fight for. But I think some of the big elders, I guess, in this movement, like you know, people like Bob Bullard, people like you know, Hazel M. Johnson, these are kind of the people that spearheaded what we understand as environmental justice today, or kind of the framework of environmental justice. I think the work that they did is what creates the ability for us to do this work today. And so many of us are standing on their shoulders as a result of a lot of the really huge work and struggles that they went through. We're able to have these conversations today and are able to do this work. So I think, especially over the last year, we've had a lot of conversations around the intersections of social justice and environmental justice, and how they really are very much interconnected, and just, you know, very much intersectional, because environmental justice and social justice are, you know, rooted in the same things, and the same communities that should be able to have that justice and have that future where they have access to clean air and clean water. But it doesn't just stop at that. It also is access to joy. It's access to community, access to the ability to just have, you know, access to the outdoors and like go outside and experience that, which so many other people have had historically the opportunity to experience. And so I think the fact that we're able to have these more nuanced conversations is the progress that has been made. I think for a really long time, activists and organizers had to even prove the point that, you know, injustices exist. And I think now we're in a better place, because I think as a society, we understand the injustices more and are able to have conversations about the nuances and the niches, and are able to really dissect them, and then as a result, create solutions for them. And I think that's one of the big things that I've seen like throughout this movement. And I think that really goes back to the work that a lot of these environmental justice leaders were able to do and continue to do.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And Paige, I want to hear a little bit of your thoughts on just how your writing maybe has captured some of these nuances, and how you might encourage some of the other writers as well in the environmental justice space to really hone in on those.
Yeah, that's a great question. I do think it's important to define progress on EJ issues locally. So I can say that for Massachusetts, where I am, being based in Boston, there was a huge climate justice bill passed earlier this year in the Mass state, which is really impactful and has been the result of the work done by EJ activists for a long time. And the important bit of that bill is that it actually is going to kind of outline some protections for certain communities in Boston that are known to be EJ hotspots, right? So Chelsea, Mattapan, Dorchester, places that are just largely BIPOC areas. So I think that that's a big win for the movement. In terms of like the work left to be done, how writing might fit in is, I definitely think there is still some conflation of social media activism with political action, right? So even that we cover and write about environmental issues, there needs to be a clear connection between, buzzy think pieces and sort of divisive op-eds about climate and what people are meant to be doing about those issues as a follow-up. So I think with this climate bill that happened in Massachusetts, it was really important to get bipartisan coverage of that. It was really important to get fair and consistent news and press coverage around it leading up to the bill, because that does sway public opinion. So again, important to define progress locally here and think about how we can translate content and media and online engagement into political action, like what we saw here in Massachusetts.
Yeah, that's great. I actually didn't know about that. I know a lot of us for NYC Climate Week, we're in New York, so a lot of the policy news about environment tends to come locally. And Chante, I did want to hear your thoughts also about environmental justice and its intersection with business as well, and whether there's sort of a tandem there that can progress into the future.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think about environmental justice as something that needs to be proactive and reactive, and rather than reactive, I should say. And that's something that I've kind of made my mission, to be honest, and how I approach my career. I think, I mentioned Women of Color Collective and Sustainability, goes by Woke Sis for short. That was birthed out of my own desire to have more space and community, as oftentimes the only woman of color in the room. And I think when we talk about environmental justice, you use the phrase meaningful involvement. And I think that's oftentimes what's missing, right? And so I didn't pride myself on being the only person in the room. It made me sick. I was tired of it. It was exhausting. And so myself and my co-founder, who's really just a good friend of mine, who happened to be a Dominican woman who was the only woman of color at an event that we went to, decided we would be resources to one another. And that's really how Woke Sis was born, because one day we said, it's great that we're doing this for each other, but there has to be a bunch of other women of color out there just as tired and exhausted and lonely as we are. And, Woke Sis really started as sort of a passion project to feel like I had more community, but also give other women of color community. And we went from being sort of a 40-person meetup in New York to now a collective that reaches over 5,000 women of color across the globe. And, it was really because it was needed, not because we had some master plan to, take over the space. That was just how much women of color were desiring, a type of community where they could be full and seen and whole. And, it's been an inspiration to me as I do this work. So when I think about how we've made strides, I think we're talking about it. We're seeing more women, people of color at the table, sort of having leadership roles. But I think the biggest gap that still exists for me is the fact that we're oftentimes the ones who hold the burden of being the advocates and being the sole people who are not only expected to be experts in what we do. I work in climate innovation. I run a climate tech venture studio, but I also oftentimes as a Black woman have to hold the weight of bringing in environmental justice and equity in a real way. And I think the only way we get to a point where environmental justice is real is when I'm myself, honestly, none of the other women of color on this call are the only ones talking about environmental justice, that it's woven into every business practice, into every idea, into every thesis of how we actually run our economy. And so that's what my team and I think a lot about over at Second Use, is how do we actually build economies of the future that center these practices, rather than, I think, what has oftentimes happened, not, as a result of BIPOC communities, but just as a result of how power dynamics work, is we're oftentimes responding to things that are unjust, or, having a say after many decisions have been made or many people have already benefited from unjust practices. And I think for me, it's how do we reimagine doing that just all together? How do we actually create a world where it's woven into everyone's ideal, regardless of identity, and we're all taking ownership of the fact that, climate change is not impacting every community in the same. We know that communities of color are disproportionately impacted, and we know that we also were not at the forefront of causing this problem. And I think we have to have really frank, honest, transparent conversations about that, not only in government, not only in impact, but also across business. And so I think a lot about that in my role.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think what you said about wokesis just being out of need, that rang really, that struck a chord within me, especially since I actually ended up joining Women in Climate Tech, which all of these other amazing women are also part of. And for any women who are in the climate space and interested in using tech, I highly suggest you go check out that community. It just felt really great to know that there were so many other women out there that were really working so hard on this issue that I was really passionate about, and I found a real home there. And so it's great that you're building that for other people. And I think it's something that definitely we all can work on, not just the four of us here, but everyone outside of this sphere as well can work on, just building that community where everyone can feel like they have a voice that can also translate into a powerful change. So we talked a little bit about local environmental justice. And actually a couple months ago, I spoke to an official in City Hall in New York City, and they're working to deploy this climate resilience construction project on Manhattan's Lower East Side. So for anyone in New York City, you might have heard of the Big U. So that's downtown. They're just trying to build essentially a wall, but also like raise the ground with some permeable infrastructure in order to prevent flooding. And this official at City Hall expressed that sometimes it was very difficult to have these organized community meetings because sometimes she felt that the community members had lost some of their trust in the local officials and in the government. And she found that it was difficult to sort of reestablish that trust between the local officials and the communities that this infrastructure project is going to affect. So I wanted to hear, Kiana, since you've been working on this a little bit, your thoughts on just in general, how to bridge that gap between the people who are making these, who are, deploying these construction projects and the communities that are being affected.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think something that resonates not in just that space, but I think in a lot of, again, it kind of goes back to what I was talking about with experts. I think this is an issue that happens a lot within academia as well, and within just research as well. So many research projects and papers that are written about, again, those frontline communities and a lot of climate issues are experts, a lot of like white old men that go into a community, make their assessment without talking to anyone from that community, without understanding any of the context or history of that community, making some assumptions, and then they leave, and then they are like, okay, so here's how you fix these problems that I'm saying you have, without even understanding if those problems are even problems within the community. And I think that happens in so many spaces. It happens in the tech space when engineers are creating software that they don't understand the social implications of. It happens in infrastructure like you're talking about. And it's just happening all over the place because there's such a disconnect within academia and like these communities. And I think one, like if you want to stop this from happening, is to create space for community members to be in those decision-making processes. It's to not only uplift their voices and interact with them in a really meaningful way and understand the actual problems, understand the context, understand the history. But it's also like investing in those communities. It's about providing the resources for those community members and leaders to actually create the solutions themselves, to have the ability to understand the science and to understand the technology, to then be able to say, okay, this is my expertise as a community member. I understand, the issues that we're facing, but I also have the tools and I also have access to the knowledge to be able to solve those issues within my own community. And so I think it's a really big problem that is now kind of hard to fix, but I don't think it's too late to fix. And one of the ways that we can bridge those relationships is to create those spaces for community members to be able to do the work, but also be compensated for it. Like have the ability to share that outwardly and publicly, to have their names be on publications, to be, to have positions in the decision-making spaces. And I think there's been a movement to incorporate community input more often, but it's for free. It's so exploitative. And I think we need to just like restructure that thinking as well and be like, as an engineer, I think about this a lot, is like, do I even need to like be in a space, like, do I even have to like go to this community and try to solve their problems? Maybe like my role is to instead like offer my skills, offer my access to resources, instead of like being like, hey, this is a problem and like I'm gonna fix it for you. And I think it's just like there are all of these questions that I think we need to think about before we even start a project. And we just need to be more receptive to the voices of leaders that are already doing this work, and just to create that space for them to be able to solve issues in their own communities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's really interesting what you said just about, in general, we need to just do a better job of arming people with enough knowledge to really understand even what's going on. Because I know that for many of these projects, there's a lot of documentation, there's a lot of news written about them, but it's not particularly interpretable. Sometimes it just might feel like sort of a whole wash of policy and things that people they can't really relate to personally and don't understand why it should be important to them. So over to Paige, because you do a lot of writing, is there a way that even like on a personal level that each of us can kind of communicate that knowledge or that importance, and how can we do that in a way that is like really accessible to these communities?
Yeah. So this is a big question. I mean, as Kiana was talking, I was thinking about, as we're communicating about these issues, the importance of communicating to build collective power, as opposed to communicating to build or to like drive individual impact. I think broadly, it does worry me that as people think about ways they can get involved in the climate movement, their first question is often, I don't know where to make the most impact. How can I act in a way that drives the most impact? It's always on this sort of individual level of impact. But I posit that it's actually more important to act in a way that builds collective power. So things like writing to organize your neighbors, or trying to join a coalition that already exists, or join a club that already exists, or trying to get involved in the public commentary period for a bill in your state. So I do think it's important to kind of to talk about these things in a way that encourages folks to join an existing body or coalition that already has power or inroads into action, versus trying to shout into a void of online or in person, where there may not actually be as much like follow through, if that makes sense. There's a lot here just to unpack, but that's kind of my initial thought.
Yeah, I think it's definitely interesting, because I found that, like you said, a lot of people who are first looking at the climate space, they have a certain skill set from whatever background that they had, like a different type of tech startup or law or whatever, and they're kind of looking to see, okay, what does my experience have to do with climate? And then like, where can I do this? Where can I do that? But I think it's certainly important to see ourselves not just as, the positions or the titles that we hold, but also just as community members and as members of this world, but also even just our localities. And there's a way for us to kind of go out there and create these sort of localized groups of power within that scheme. So I think that's really interesting. And Chante, I was wondering if you had sort of any input on maybe where the role of sort of innovation and tech is in this whole scheme of, because tech and the internet is such a big sort of expanse of just connection. It's just a ginormous community. And if we can find a way to sort of build this collective power, even virtually, like we're doing right now, just because it's so important that we're connecting with other people from all across the world and we get to share these different perspectives. So I was wondering if you had sort of some ideas on how tech is already being used as this sort of connection platform.
Yeah, I think tech is such a broad word and it can mean a lot of different things, but I'll speak from, I guess, just more of looking at not necessarily social media, but yeah, connection points that technologies have. And obviously through things like COVID and just the experiences that we've had over the past year and a half, we've seen the power of like digital collection or collective resources and work. And I think, through Wokesis, we've certainly seen that. Again, we went from being an in-person meetup to now, having women from all over the globe reach out to us and say, thank you for starting this. Like, this has been an incredible resource for me. I want to start a chapter in my, city or town or country. And I think that's incredible because I think Paige's point, gets us out of the framework of just thinking about ourselves, but recognizing like, climate change is a global issue. It needs to be solved by every single person on this planet. And so I think that's what's so interesting about whether you're talking about tech, policy, all of the different entry points for climate. This isn't always at the forefront, but there should be this understanding that none of us alone are going to solve this problem. No one sector is going to solve this problem, no one idea, no one thought process. And so I think I like to come to the work that I do with humility. And I think we need more of that in all aspects of the work that is being done in the climate space. I think whether you're talking to a scientist or, someone in the tech, a VC, stakeholder, or someone who's building something, whether it's a founder or just a small business owner, it's the realization that we all don't know everything, and that's okay. And so I think doubling down on what we do know, how we do feel about the work that we do, and I think really being a connection point, which is what I do. My career didn't start out in innovation and tech. I started out launching national issue-based campaigns under the Obama administration. Never thought I'd be in business, worked across various sectors, realized there was a great opportunity at the intersection of climate, technology, and innovation to do good, and I think sometimes we lose sight of that because we'll see only the bad that's been done or the way that things have been created in the past. But the reality is that tech is created by human beings. It's not some nebulous thing that just pops up, the next day. That the Facebooks, the platforms, the Instagrams that we use were created by human beings, which, on one hand, we might go, oh no, that sucks. But on the other hand, it means it's fixable because it was created by human beings, right? And so I think I like to come into this work from an optimistic perspective, in part because I work with such early stage founders. And, we do a lot of work, not only around how do you create solutions that are science-based, that have the right technology, but also how do you create better leaders? And I think that's what we're really getting at when we talk about innovation. I don't look at innovation as solely, what's the new science or the new way of doing something as it relates to being tech enabled. I look at it as like, how are you rethinking and reimagining the way that things have been done? And I mean, if most tech people, that's what they've prided themselves on, kind of disrupting things and changing the way markets have been used. I think I think that has been misplaced though and misinformed because we don't have the diversity of voices and thoughts in that process. And so I see myself as a part of that. I see all of our communities as a part of that. And I think, while it's not our job to break down the door and tell people to let us in, we can create these types of solutions and scale them. And so I think, coming from myself and then the Latina woman who run Venture for Climate Tech, we're the first 2 women of color to ever run, which is bizarre that I'm saying this in 2021, but it's true, to ever run a venture studio in this space and be at the helm of creating curriculum that drives the future businesses. And we know that we're doing things differently, and we pride ourselves in doing those things differently. And tech is not in a silo. In order for it to work, you have to engage with community still, you have to deploy it. And that's very obvious to me. And, our hope is that we're instilling that in our founders and how they think about their solutions.
Yeah. I mean, that's fantastic. And I also want to jump on what you said about opportunity and kind of approaching this space with an optimistic lens. And if anybody checks out my LinkedIn and reads any of the things that I post on there, I have been trying, I don't know to what avail yet, but I've been trying to get the hashtag climate opportunity trending a little bit more, just because, well, just with my own posts, but just because I think it's so important that we keep this idea of crisis along with this idea of opportunity. So we keep those both sort of in tandem, because to me, I've seen a lot of actually younger people closer to my age and even younger saying, oh no, this is such a big problem, what are we going to do? And then almost like having this mindset of, okay, there is nothing I can do. And that to me is soul crushing. It's almost like we need to really hone in on those opportunities and emphasize that there really is, we're at this huge crossroads right now, and there's so much opportunity to attack a lot of the problems in front of us. And so that's just something that I personally wanted to put out there at some point during this hour. And I think it's a great transition also into the youth mobilization piece of our discussion. And so I want to just go around quickly to all of you and ask how young people and students specifically, maybe slightly older, slightly younger, the range is flexible. How can young people take action and create these equitable solutions? And how can we get more engaged with our local communities? Just even like as simple as, an action as going to your congressman or congresswoman and speaking to them. Are there any specific concrete actions that you did take or you wish you would have taken when you were younger? And we can go reverse order. We can start with Chante.
Sure. I was not particularly engaged with climate when I was younger. I will say I came from a family of just civil servants, and my grandmother was a civil rights activist. So, as a young girl, there was never a thought in my mind about having an impact in terms of creating positive change for people. There was just always a belief in me that our individual actions, do add up to collective action that makes changes. And I felt that deeply because I saw it firsthand and my ability to live the life that I was living because of the actions my grandmother took. But I say that to say that, when you're young, you have an amazing imagination. And I think you're also fearless. And not to say that I'm not still imaginative and fearless, but the world has a way of kind of pulling that out of you and ensuring that you don't think creatively. Creativity is always what has been at the helm of change, getting people to shift their mindsets, their behaviors. I think taking your unique perspectives and turning that into whatever form you think resonates with you and your peers is so powerful. I think not putting too much pressure on yourself to feel like there's one way. I think oftentimes when I talk to young people, we do immediately think of policy and politics and social media. And those are, of course, a couple of different ways to engage, and they certainly matter, but there are so many other ways to create change. Art creates change. Stories create change. I think creating a platform for you and your peers to even talk about what it is that's coming up for you is powerful. I think in terms of some tangible things that I've just heard from youth over the past couple of years, because I've done some work actually at the intersection of youth action and business, is, curriculum, like actually pushing. It still blows my mind that you have to wait until you get to college to maybe study some things about the environment. I imagine that might be changing, but I think pushing your school and your school board to actively create educational courses for you and your peers so that you can be ahead of the curve, so you can feel like you have the knowledge and don't have to do it solely on your own. Creating clubs that you can have these types of conversations and push these efforts forward. And I think honestly, reaching out to people, I know sometimes reaching out to older people who you think maybe are doing, lots of things is nerve-wracking. But I mean, I wouldn't be here if Karina didn't reach out to me right via LinkedIn. And the worst thing that could have happened is that she said that I said no, or I just can't do this tonight, but that she would have still had an entry point. So like, don't be scared to reach out to people, even if you're like, oh man, they may not respond. You never know. And so I think acknowledging that you have a lot of power that you can assert just by using your voice and reaching out to folks and having conversations. But those are just a couple. I'm sure there's lots more.
Yeah, jumping on that, I just wanted to say that for any younger people we have in the audience, that it's certainly possible to start your own initiative. Climate Week NYC actually lets you submit events as an individual. So you don't need to be affiliated with any sort of organization or whatsoever. And over the summer, I was just thinking, hey, Climate Week's coming up, let's do something. And so here we are. So these things are definitely possible to just pursue your own passion projects, even if you think you might be too young or people might not listen to you. It's just take every opportunity to try. And Paige, if you want to add a little bit.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I mean, first I want to say that, the old hegemony of white men that Kiana was talking about are fucking like scared of youth. Like, you'd be surprised at how much, to your point, Karina, like youth have so much power because we're gonna fucking outlive all these old folks. We're gonna be here for the actual climate change that's happening. We're gonna see the worst effects of it. We already are, honestly, and we are very motivated to actually drive home change. People are really afraid of that. And so thinking about, how we can harness that power, I'm a very tactical person, so I'll say a handful of things. One is that more cities now are acknowledging the power that youth have in the movement and are starting what's called like youth climate advisory positions or youth climate councils, where people who are in high school or even a little bit older or younger can actually join a citywide body to shape local policy. And that is a very clear and direct way that you can have an impact as a youth if your town or community has some kind of youth climate council. So look that up and see if you can get involved in that. I'd say if you're in a college or university setting, learn about the divestment movement on that campus. Because here in Boston, Harvard just announced they're not going to invest their endowment in fossil fuels anymore. That is a huge thing for institutions like Harvard, who have been fucking like slow to change, slow to even respond to climate and more extractive industries, are now saying they're not going to invest any more in that. And again, it's a small drop in the bucket, perhaps in the landscape of the movement, but it's huge for Boston, right? So if you're in that college setting or in that world or near that world, learn about the divestment campaigns in that community. The last thing I want to say is that we're almost at November. So if you're a voter in any of the states or cities, local elections really matter. So when I say local, I mean Boston citywide campaigns can shape like where they build landfills, like how different things in the city are shaped and how they happen as it relates to climate. Who gets what contracts for like composting. Even the sort of the nitty gritty of everyday minutia that touches environmentalism is shaped by citywide policy. So vote in local elections. That's really important if you can. So I'll say that, but keep thinking about this.
Yeah, this is one of the moments when I wish I could vote. I wished I could vote for a number of years now, but next year I don't have to wait any longer. Just one more year and then I can finally vote. But yeah, I would say that just general civic engagement with any resources that are available in the city are so powerful. And also, speaking to some of my experience that I talked about earlier, officials at City Hall are very open to speaking with you if you're interested in learning about a climate initiative that's going on, or really anything in the city that is part of city policy. They're very open to speaking with you. So anyone of all ages in the audience, if you're interested in just anything that's going on in your city policy wise, if you find an initiative that you're interested in, reach out to your officials, your local officials. They're more than happy to set up a call with you. Yeah, and Kiana, if you want to add your thoughts.
Yeah. Oh my God, there are so many tangents I want to go on. Paige and Chante are just saying things and I'm like, yes. But yeah, I mean, I feel like I've been not working, but this has been like a big part of my life since I was like 8 years old. So there have been so many iterations of like climate work that I've kind of been a part of and started and found community in. And I think that is a really beautiful thing about this work, is community. And I think for me that is like the one thing that I think everyone has access to and is able to like create for themselves. And I think recently I've been thinking a lot about coalition building and the importance of that, because it's really important to start these movements within your community, and they start really small and then they grow a little bit, and then one person brings in another person, and then that person brings in another person. And I think that's the really beautiful thing about community. But the thing with coalition building is that you're able to bring all of these mini communities together, and you're able to like raise your voice in such a big way, because now you have like all of these different organizations, all of these different communities that have intersectional identities, that have intersecting passions and, you know, ideas and innovative like thoughts for what the future should look like. And that is so powerful. I think too often we see a lot of wheels being rebuilt, especially on college campuses. I see this all the time, because the thing is, like, as a college organizer, like my time on campus is maybe at best 4 years long, but the administration is going to be there for 40 years. And so a lot of times when a movement grows really big, they'll just wait it out. Like they'll just wait for those like super loud students to be gone, graduate, and then they go back to doing what they were doing before. So by building coalitions, by having intergenerational organizations and groups, we're able to keep that strength going, and we're able to like make sure that it continues to be a really big thing on campus, in the institution you're a part of, wherever it is that you are. Like community is just so important. And I think that is like what my one big thing is. You just have to get involved in what's already happening, because sometimes you don't have to create something new. Sometimes there's like space for you already. And you just kind of have to like find that space and make sure that you can grow within those organizations. So that's a really big thing. And then like Chante was talking about, I think we underestimate the power of creativity and art. And there's, I don't know if anyone here is familiar with Adrienne Maree Brown, but she talks a lot about the act of radical imagination and how incredibly important that is. And I think that is so key in the work that needs to continues to be done, whether that's through art, whether that's through innovating through tech. Like these are all just things that we need for our future, and everyone belongs in the solution making. Engineers belong, writers belong, artists belong. Everyone is needed for the future that we're going to create, because that future is for all of us, and it should be for all of us. So no matter what it is, like if you're in high school or if you're in middle school and you want to study this or you want to study that, you're passionate about art, just know that within the climate justice movement, like there is a space for you, and you'll find it if you just look. And sometimes you do have to create it, and you'll find people that want to create it with you, but you're never alone. There are always people there that want to do this with you.
Yeah, I think that's really great especially what you said about how interdisciplinary the whole space is. I think that's just like one of the most amazing things to me about climate work in general, is that there are so many different angles that you can take to attack this issue. And especially if I've met quite a few people who are already seasoned professionals in different fields, and they're thinking, wow, this is a super important issue that I really need to start supporting, and I need to start using my knowledge and my resources to give that support to the climate space. And they were kind of confused as to what they should do. And so I would think the first thing I told them is just, you have a lot of skills that are going to be really, really important, because those skills need to extend into the future, and they can also be adapted to become more sustainable and more just environmentally. And so that's something that I always tell people who are kind of searching for a way into the justice movement and the climate movement, is just, where do I start? And often it's just with the things that you already know. And jumping off of that, I wanted to ask you, Paige, in particular, because you're super interested in the media space. We know how much the news and the media is influencing our personal lives. And we also have an audience question from an aspiring writer. And so they're wondering, when writing about environmental justice, how to tailor their message best, and what techniques to use to really call people to action, and how that can be better communicated through writing. And Chante and Kiana, if you have thoughts on this, you can also jump in after.
And I mean, first off, if you are a writer, if you write, then you're a writer. I mean, no need to say aspiring if you don't feel like that is necessary, right? Get used to think of yourself as a writer if you write. Is my first kind of note there. Second note is, I think because there's been a history of like of twisting the truth and like misinformation from the right when it comes to climate science, we need to tell the truth and like speak from the facts. So if you're writing about EJ, which is great, you have an obligation and a duty to tell the facts of whatever you're talking about, plain as day, right? But then imbue like strong storytelling in that. So no one is like inspired by reading dry scientific findings, for instance, right? It's really about telling the truth, and then also weaving in the emotion and human experience that I think so heavily shapes our experience in the climate movement. So that's kind of the second nugget, is like tell the truth, but also like talk about emotion, feeling, the human experience of climate, because that is the hardest part of doing the work, right? The second part is, or the last part is like, don't stress too much about trying to like talk to everyone. Not every bit of writing is for everyone, And if you're trying to really mobilize youth, it's helpful, obviously, if you have your own experience to talk about, but also like talk to youth. Include their perspective in the piece or whatever you're talking about, because that will be compelling. So, don't worry too much about trying to talk to everyone, because perhaps this piece, whatever you're working on, isn't for everyone, it's for youth in particular. And if so, center that perspective in the writing. And like those rules can kind of apply across the spectrum of environmental writing for sure.
If Chante and Kiana, you guys have anything to add, Kiana, go ahead.
Yeah, I really love this question, because this is something that I am really passionate about as well. I feel like as I go into my senior year and I'm trying to figure out like, what do I want to do? I think writing is becoming more and more integral to the future, like that I want to be a part of and exist in. And I think the reason for that is because writing is and has always been one of the strongest forms of storytelling, and one of the strongest forms of like changing perspectives. And I think I've started to do this a little bit, even through like just my Instagram captions. Like something as simple as that is like, how do I tell my story authentically? And then how do I make sure that that reflects the story of other people as well? Because it's very likely, even though that we all have our own experiences and we all have our own stories, there are other people that resonate with your story. And so I think as writers, or even as journalists, we often have this like perspective of being objective, and this, we're told like you can't bring emotions into the story. We're told that you know, you have to take your own experience as a writer, and you're supposed to take your own perspectives and biases out of what you write. But I think like that doesn't make sense, you know. Everything is biased and everything has perspective to it, so why are we trying to pretend like it doesn't? And the way that we write really impactful things is through sharing those stories, sharing those experiences, and often it's about sharing our own biases and our own perspectives and how they shape our knowledge of things. And I think just like I was saying before, that, you know, frontline communities are the experts in a lot of these issues that we're talking about. Their stories like has to be told too. And I think like uplifting those voices and incorporating them into our writing, into our storytelling, whichever format that may be, is really, really important. And it allows for our perspectives and stories to be told, but it also allows for others' perspectives to be told. And that is what makes really impactful writing, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think that's great.
Oh, go ahead, Karina.
Oh no, I was just gonna say I think that's great. And Chante, you can go ahead and say your piece as well.
Sure. I was just going to say, I think if you work in climate, you're a storyteller, no matter what you're doing. You know, we literally have storytelling workshops with our founders. The idea is, how do you actually galvanize people to create action? And whether that's, you know, purchasing a product, voting, attending a community board meeting, figuring out an alternative, you know, diving into research and science, you're trying to get people to fundamentally either shift their action or move them into action. And I think that requires storytelling, and it always has. If you think of any other major movements that have had real implications and changed the way that we exist today, they've had to think about what was the underlying story and message that was going to move people. And I think it goes back to, which I'll be using that hashtag, Karina, to help you out, was a climate optimism. I think it's so important that we think about the optimistic side of things, because we can't change anything if we think we're already doomed. The reality is we're seeing the consequences, we're seeing the implications, and that does not mean that we can't do something still. And I think that oftentimes gets lost in the climate conversation, because it's so easy to just think about everything that's going wrong. And, you know, climate anxiety is real. I've spoken to a lot of youth who experience that. I experience it. And I think the reality is that there's an opportunity for us to actually shift behavior. But the only way that we can do that, and this has been proven through behavioral scientists that are way smarter than me, is to not talk about what's wrong, but to talk about the possibility and the imagination around what can be right. And so I just encourage all of you, as you think about your own story, your own messaging, your own writing, that you bring optimism and imagination back into it. So double clicking on everything Kiana said, I think it's just so critical if we're going to solve this, if we're going to have an impact. You have to believe you can have an impact. You have to tell a story that encourages other people. And so, yeah, I mean, that's what I do, even when it's hard, right? And so I think that's the role of all of us in this work, but to also support each other and kind of have that reminder. And, you know, there are days where I'm like, man, this is rough, you know, this is hard. And I have people in my circle, that's what Wokesis is, who remind me like, hey, you're not alone. We're all doing this. We're all figuring it out. So find your people, be optimistic, and think of yourself as a storyteller.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's all of what you said really resonated with me, because I made a website and just like started blogging a little bit on it. To be honest, it was like more of a just, I need to like vent my feelings, and writing is a great way to do it. But also it was pretty cathartic to just like look at everything that I kind of reflect on everything that I've done in the climate space so far, and write a little piece about it. And yeah, actually, we have a great question from the audience, which is, how do you avoid burnout as an activist or organizer in the climate space? And this is something that I know has been very, very challenging for a lot of people that are in the climate space already. And that includes people who are established climate scientists who are just very tired of having people ask them the same questions every day, and from them to activists and people everywhere in between. So Chante, if you want to start us off on this, and then we can go.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's being kind to yourself and understanding your limits, but also that you probably will burn out. I mean, if you are some magical human who figures out how to avoid it, bravo, I congratulate you. I have not had that experience. But I say that to say that rest is important in this work. I think if you're a writer, and I also am a writer, I write part-time, I have my own newsletter, I write poetry, I'm a very reflective person, and I know that I need to carve out that space so I can show up as my best self. And so I think knowing what you need, which sometimes takes time, it takes kind of figuring it out when you don't give yourself what you need, and then asking your body and your mind to tell you, right, to kind of sit in that silence and give you the space to figure it out. But yeah, I think just, rest, drinking water, like the things that feel like easy, but I think when you are busy and you're in the work, it's so easy to forget these things. But really just knowing yourself and making space for that, making space for rest and relaxation so that you can come back into this work energized. Yeah, I'll pause there.
Yeah, for sure. That's definitely one of the most important things that even I, having only been in the climate space for maybe like 2-3 years, just definitely needed at least some time to sit back and recharge and do various different things. Like I was mentioning my blog, but also I post on LinkedIn just things that I find really interesting. But it's nice to have that time where you can just kind of sit back and read a little bit and not have to be sort of at the front lines talking, doing your thing all the time. Yeah, so Paige, if you want to add on, and then Kiana.
Yeah, I would say, plus one to what Chante said, I would add, get offline. There's a big culture around, like social media activism and being online as a way of mobilizing folks. And that's obviously important. But it's also I would argue more important to get offline, be in nature, go outdoors. There's a lot of study work that shows that nature has a lot of restorative properties for your mental health and your overall happiness. And who better deserves that than folks who are doing climate work, right? So get offline, go outside is a big one for me, at least. And I'd also say, embrace slowness. And that might seem counterintuitive when you're working on stuff like climate that feels so incredibly urgent. And I feel like that because of that, we have a tendency to overwork ourselves, to have long work days, or to overcommit ourselves to things outside of work. And I worry that the same speediness that happens in other extractive industries that got us here, right, is happening in climate work. So I do want to encourage folks to move intentionally and where it matters slowly, to do things right the next time, to work mindfully, to make time for yourself, to decouple speed from progress, right? A big capitalism value there. So again, embrace slowness and get offline and go outside. So that I would say.
Yeah, I'm working on taking that one for myself, actually. Kiana, go ahead if you had any final thoughts.
Yeah, I think like Chante said, it's impossible to avoid this. I think I'm really reaching my burnout peak right now, but I will leave us with more words from Adrienne Maree Brown, who really spearheads pleasure activism and also just the concept of rest as resistance. And I think something that she talks about is making your activism pleasurable and also joyful. So she talks about just creating community spaces that are about healing, that are about joy, that are about experiencing all of those things that we want for our future now. So how do we create, even for one day, even for 2 hours, a space in which we are all just eating and drinking and dancing and listening to music and creating art? That's the future we want to have. So why don't we practice that right now with each other? Why don't we create those spaces in the smallest way possible for our own friends, for other organizers around us? How do we make sure that we are not only practicing care for ourselves, but also offering that opportunity for those around us as well. And so I try to do that at least once a week and just like have a little gathering with the people around me and make sure that they have food and they have like an outdoor nature space, and that they're able to come together and just step away from the work that they have to do. And I think that that's been like really, really important to me. And I think that it's something that we can all practice and all should do. And then lastly, I think we have a tendency to create our organizing spaces like the things we're trying to fight. Like we create these spaces like the institutions that we're trying to fight, and it just creates this pattern of overworking. And I think Paige just touched us on this too, but like, why do we structure these agents of change like the very things that we're fighting against? So I think it's just about fully restructuring our own capitalistic notions and fully restructuring the ways that we think about change and the ways that we think about progress, to make sure that we're not repeating those same mistakes and those same patterns of exhaustion and capitalism and burnout for the people around us and the people that we work with. So those are just my thoughts.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you so much. And I think one of just all of these things I'm going to try to take for myself, even to just be taking breaks and also make sure I've got time to be with my friends and sort of have that time for relaxation and recharging. And so, yeah, that's going to wrap up our night. And if there's one thing that you take away from this, it's that you have a lot of power in your hands. I think we all touched on this. You have the power to make a change. Even if you think it's small, there's a lot of actions that you can take. Not just even if you're young, we have audience with a wide age range as well. So old, young, student, professional, of any walk of life, you definitely have the personal power to make a change and to really have not just a personal impact, but also just joining in with a lot of the groups that are already around you. So thank you all so much for joining us. And a couple of final reminders: this recording is going to be available to you within the coming days on YouTube. And again, if this was your first NYC climate event, or you don't know about this already, there are a ton of other events as well. You can check them out there. Okay, I think the link is wrong, but you all can find it. So head to Climate Week NYC/events. Thank you all so much again for being here, and have a wonderful rest of your night.
Thank you all so much.
Bye.